Following the death of Fëanor, whose flame burned the greatest of all the Noldor, in the face of the immense darkness which he had striven so valiantly to best, the Noldor were faced with a leadership change and a potentially devastating loss of impetus in their quest for the Silmarils in the War of the Jewels. Into the void stepped the son of the fallen creator of the Silmarils, Maethros, who sought to take the reins of the campaign and provide a modicum of rational leadership. You might, like Tolkien, take an interest in the languages of the world, and even if you don't go so far as to make your own language like he did, learning ones that already exist is both a great way to boost your brain and to see a new culture in a completely different way. We say this because with this video, we're bringing you a special offer from our sponsor, Babbel. It's a language learning app that specializes in real-world applications, such as all the stuff you need to enjoy travel. It's got short 10-minute lessons designed by real language teachers, no algorithms or AI, and they can be taken in many forms: online lessons, videos, podcasts, or games. Let's say you're a Gondor fan, and knowing that Tolkien said he based Gondor on the Byzantine Empire, you want to go take a look at its real-life remains. Babbel lets you learn the Turkish you'll need to get around Istanbul, either on desktop or mobile devices.
Müze nerede?
Müze nerede? Where's the museum? Get really good, and you can ask where Gondor was when the Westfold fell too. It's quick to learn the basics, and it makes sure you know them with constant reinforcement throughout. Babbel is scientifically proven to get you up to speed in a new language in only 3 weeks, and if it looks like it's not going to happen for you, they offer a 20-day money-back guarantee. So go find out why Babbel is one of the best language learning apps in the world. Even better, use our link in the description to get a 60% discount off a Babbel subscription, including a lifetime subscription. It was not long after the Dagor-nuin-Giliath and Fëanor's passing that an envoy from the Dark Lord came to the elves acknowledging defeat. This envoy offered terms that included the possible return of a Silmaril. Maethros was cautious in going out to meet this embassy though, and brought with him more troops than was deemed necessary. His caution was well founded, but his preparations proved to be inadequate, as Morgoth had also expected treachery and sent a greater force, including a number of Balrogs. When the two groups met, the elves were slain en masse, despite fighting valiantly, and Maethros was captured. Morgoth quickly sent word to the Noldor that if they were to forswear their oath and turn aside from the path of vengeance, Maethros would be released unharmed. The elves were not so easily fooled, however, and sent no answer, knowing Maethros would never be released in spite of their actions. Morgoth's response was a brutal one, much in keeping with his nature. Maethros was hung from the face of a precipice of Thangordrim by the wrist of his right hand, using a band forged from unbreakable steel, and was forced to hang from this steep point in immense pain while he gazed upon the plains where his people were unable to come to his aid due to the impenetrable fortifications the Dark Lord had erected. A further complication, and what would ultimately prove to be Maethros' salvation, came in the guise of the internal divisions of the Noldor. Following their victory at the Battle of Lamoth, Fingolfin chased down the surviving orcs, who had caused the death of his youngest child. They chased them to the very fortress of Angband. However, the forces of the Dark Lord did not come out to meet the elvish threat. This was not due to the threat posed by Fingolfin's host, but rather the first rising of the sun, as this creation of the Vala Aului forced the servants of Morgoth to cower within the halls and dungeons of Angband. While this was viewed as the triumph of elven valor over the deafening darkness of Morgoth, none among the elvish peoples could be truly aware of what this rising was to symbolize. A chronicler writes, "And Anar the Fire Golden, fruit of Lorelin, they named the sun. But the Noldor named it Vasa, the heart of fire, that awakens and consumes, for the sun was set as a sign of the awakening of men and the waning of the elves." Still, the coming of the sun and the moon meant that the First Age had begun. Fingolfin then led his host to the northern shores of Lake Mithrim, where they came into contact with the Fëanorian element of Noldor, whom they had not seen since their great betrayal. Tensions between the two factions threatened to lead them into a civil war, were it not for the heroic actions of the son of Fingolfin, Fingon. Maethros was the cousin of Fingon and a great friend of his, in spite of the animosity between the two factions. Hearing of his dear cousin's imprisonment, Fingon endeavoured to rescue him from the immense suffering of his captivity. Oddly enough, he was aided in this endeavour by Morgoth himself. In response to the emergence of the sun and the moon, Morgoth was left with little option but to blanket the skies around Angband with an almost impenetrable set of clouds, formed primarily of ash and smoke, in order to shield his servants from the damage which the light could cause them. Still, the servants of the Dark Lord displayed their inherent cowardice by refusing to leave Angband, as they were still left in fear of the newly emerged lights. So the valiant Fingon approached Angband aided by the darkness of the ash clouds, with the cowardly orcs allowing him to reach Thangorodrim without encountering any resistance. However, as Angband remained virtually impenetrable, Fingon instead decided to sing a song of defiance, refusing to give in to the despair Morgoth had hoped to instill in all who came to gaze upon his abode. This proved fortuitous, as Maethros, hearing the song, joined in, allowing Fingon to locate his cousin. However, when he neared his friend, Fingon realized that he could not save him. Unwilling to continue to live in perpetual despair and anguish through his imprisonment, Maethros begged Fingon to shoot him. Though it broke his heart to consider the loss of his friend, Fingon acquiesced to the request. However, before he loosed the arrow, he prayed to Manwë to grant the arrow speed in order to reduce Maethros' suffering. This prayer and plea for mercy was heard by Thorondor, the king of the Eagles, who prevented Fingon from engaging in yet another kinslaying before flying him up to Maethros' side. Here, a further terrible realization that the band could not be broken led Maethros to once more beg for death. Instead, Fingon severed his friend's hand, allowing them to escape on the back of Thorondor, who returned them to their kin. Here, the true courage and compassion displayed by this son of Fingolfin stayed the impending disaster of civil war. Maethros recovered from his wound swiftly, and in gratitude for the rescue, and as an attempt of sorts to atone for his father's betrayal, Maethros relinquished all claim to the High Kingship, making his uncle Fingolfin the High King of the Noldor, an act his brothers were in no way happy about. Seeing that this may cause issues down the line, Maethros moved the more prone to anger and rash decision-making of his brothers to an area around the Hill of Hammering, where he would rule what would come to be known as the March of Maethros. Despite his miraculous recovery, Maethros never forgot nor forgave the suffering which was wrought upon him, and this drove him to become an even greater and more deadly swordsman with his left hand than he had ever been with his right. Furthermore, upon his lands he raised an imposing fortress, with the dual purpose of separating his fiery brothers from the people of Fingolfin, and also because he wished any attack from Angband to fall upon him first, so he may avenge his ill treatment at the hands of the Dark Lord. Meanwhile, under the capable stewardship of Fingolfin, who became the first High King of the Noldor in the 7th year of the First Age, many mighty kingdoms were established in Beleriand, which would prove to be a match for the continued assaults of Morgoth. The next such great test for the Elvish race came in the Dagor Aglareb, which was the third great battle fought in the First Age. While Morgoth's legions were initially terrified by the emergence of the sun and the moon, they soon overcame this fear. The Iron Mountains would spew forth flame as Morgoth sent forward many smaller groups of orcs, who first made their way through to the pass of Sirion and then to Maglor's Gap. They would fight a number of minor skirmishes along the way, as they penetrated deeply into the areas of East and West Beleriand. They were ultimately destroyed by the southern Noldor forces in conjunction with the elves, who were led by Círdan of the Phallus. However, this was naught more than an ill portent of what was yet to come. The elves, though immensely powerful, were far from a unified front outside of the Noldor. Doriath remained protected and as such shut away from the wider world, with its people unwilling to fight. The Lyquendi of Aseriand also refused to fight any further battles after the loss of their leader Denethor in the First Battle of Beleriand. In the 60th year of the First Age, the main force of orcs sallied forth from Angband. Immense in size, it spilled forth into Dothonion, where the twin sons of Finarfin, Angrod and Aegnor, barely held them at bay. The time they bought preventing the innumerable hordes of orcs from sweeping over the highlands of Dorthonion proved pivotal and gave enough time for Fingolfin and Maethros to rally their respective forces in what would be a devastating counterattack. They met the legions of Morgoth on the plains of Lothlan and Ardgallan, trapping the orcs between them in a hammer and anvil type affair. This envelopment left the orcs hopelessly outmaneuvered, with Fingolfin coming from the west and Maethros coming from the east. The majority of Morgoth's host was slaughtered wholesale, with some orcs attempting to break out and escape towards the safety of Angband. The elves, still furious from the pillaging of their lands by the orcish raiding parties, pursued them all the way to the fortress, and in sight of the gates of Angband, cut each and every orc down without mercy. Dagor Aglareb, which can be translated as the Glorious Battle from Elvish, represented the first ever complete victory of the elves over the machinations of the Dark Lord, and is seen as the starting point of the watchful peace which would come to be known as the Siege of Angband. Siege is however a misnomer, as it was a 400-year-long Noldor blockade of Angband. The elves were unable to actually assault the fortress due to its immense size and fortifications, and instead merely battled any parties of orcs that attempted to sally out in the intervening period, as the encirclement was still incomplete. Still, the elves were strong, and the impact of these small sorties was considered negligible by them. This would ultimately prove to be their undoing, as the forces of Morgoth, which emerged from the impassable north flank of the fortress, which was near the unguarded Iron Mountains, were able to take prisoners. Morgoth could then coerce these prisoners and bring them to his side, a fact the Noldor remained ignorant of. Fingolfin considered taking direct action against the fortress. However, he underestimated the true power of Morgoth and never earnestly engaged in such a strike, preferring to watch the realms of the elves flourish under the long peace. The majority of elves did not wish to engage in such action either, believing the cost in the lives of their people to be too great. Unbeknownst to them, they did not even possess the strength to overthrow Angband. According to the author, for the Noldor did not yet comprehend the fullness of the power of Morgoth, nor understand that their unaided war upon him was without final hope, whether they hasted or delayed. While this point in the First Age represented the great epoch of the strength of the elves, the rising of the sun and moon in the sky symbolized that their time as a dominant race, even at this point, would eventually be eclipsed. The elves were not the only creations of Eru who stood against Morgoth, and the dwarves aided them in the costly First Battle of Beleriand. They forged great alliances with the elves, with both peoples prospering from the trade which ensued, allowing the creation of great halls and masterful pieces of metalwork, including the invention of the famous dwarf mail and the finest steel the still young world had ever bore witness to. The most prominent of these holds were Belegost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains, and the great halls of Khazad-dûm in the Misty Mountains. Even more consequential in the battles to come, however, was the emergence of the race of Man, or the Edain, in Hildorian, following the first rising of the sun. Unfortunately, Morgoth acted quickly, corrupting many of these early men prior to their migration. This migration involved the separation of the first men into two hosts, one which went north, reaching the Sea of Rhûn, with the second group moving southwest. This northern host endured a further schism, with the lesser folk dwelling in the hills to the southwest of the sea, and the greater folk living in the woods on the northeastern shores. Meanwhile, the southern group began to speak an entirely different language, and were joined by strange peoples, whom they referred to as Droog. After a period of time, the lesser and greater folk resumed their migration, crossing Ravenian, while the southern host of men reached the White Mountains. During the crossing of Eriador, the greater folk acted as the vanguard. However, they would eventually be surpassed by the lesser folk, who under the leadership of Balan were the first to cross the Blue Mountains and reach Beleriand. The following year, the southern tribe, led by Haldad, crossed the Blue Mountains and was followed by the greater folk, led by Marak. Initially, these peoples settled in Estolad, within the lands of Amrod and Amras. with many befriending the elves living in Beleriand and entering their service in return for land and title. In this way, it came to pass that the Edain dwelt in the lands of the Eldar, some here, some there, some wandering, some settled in kindreds or small peoples, and the most part of them soon learned the Grey Elven tongue, both as a common speech among themselves and because they were eager to learn the lore of the elves. But after a time, the elf kings, seeing that it was not good for elves and men to dwell mingled together without order, and that men needed lords of their own kind, set regions apart where men could live their own lives, and appointed chieftains to hold these lands freely. They were the allies of the Eldar in war, but marched under their own leaders. Yet many of the Edain had delight in the friendship of the elves, and dwelt among them for so long as they had leave, and the young men often took service for a time in the hosts of the kings. It is at this time that the divisions between the race of man were firmly established, leading to the creation of 3 houses of man. Firstly, the House of Beor, who were dark-haired and of stout build, resembling the Noldor above all the other races of elves. They were initially discovered by the son of Finarfin and the lord of Nargothrond, Finrod Felagund, who brought them to the lands of the Noldor lord Amrod. They would remain fiercely loyal to the House of Finarfin, and later took up residence in the lands of Dothonion. The second house of the Edain would come to be known as the Haladin, or House of Haleth. They were dark-haired, but of slighter and smaller build than the first house, and were immensely reclusive in nature. As a result, they preferred to stay separate from the other men, and would be granted permission to settle in the forest of Brethil in Doriath, and preferred to generally stay out of wars. The final house was initially known as the House of Marek due to their leader of the same name. However, it would later come to be known as the House of Hador, after one of the greatest of the elf friends among their number. The Hador were the tallest of the 3 houses, and sported golden hair resembling the Vanyar elves. They were an extremely numerous tribe of a warlike nature, which caused the green elves of Assyrians to fear them. They first settled in Estelad before migrating to the Ered Wethrin, or Mountain of Shadows, and finally making their home in Dor Lormin. Their loyalty lay with the High King himself, Fingolfin. While at first, the peace provided by the siege allowed the elves and the Edain to grow ever closer, the seeds of Morgoth's taint and corruption were already being sown by his servants. To corrupt or destroy whatever so arose new and fair was ever the chief desire of Morgoth, and doubtless he had this purpose also in his errand, by fear and lies to make men the foes of the Eldar and bring them up out of the east against Beleriand. The weakness of men to stand before this corruption and remain unaltered by its malice and hatred would ultimately prove the undoing not only of the siege, but also the last great time of peace to be enjoyed by the elves of Middle-earth within Beleriand. The siege of Angband, while long-lived, could not continue indefinitely, and within the depths of that forsaken place, Morgoth planned its lifting. What was to come would be a sudden flame, burning down much of what the elves and Edain had laboured to bring about in their times of peace. However, this is the story for our next documentary on the history of the First Age. The next few videos in this series will be dedicated to the continued battles of the War of the Jewels, but we are planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing, as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.